hopefully you just watched the YouTube video about ATP synthase and you are impressed with our biology, as I often am. It's quite amazing how these all coordinate together to produce our energy. So moving on for the last part of this lecture, next we're going to talk about chemiosmotic theory. And it sounds very intimidating, but it's exactly what we've talked about before, that the energy from the return flow of the protons through the ATP provides the energy to bind ADP to phosphate to create ATP. So again, hopefully it's not beating a dead horse, but this is kind of hard to understand. So we have the downhill flow of electrons from our electron donors, NAD and FAD, that were produced from the TCA cycle. This downhill flow of electrons allows hydrogen protons to be pumped into the intramembrane space, creating an electrochemical gradient as the protons want to get back into the matrix so that they can, because they're attracted to this more negatively charged area, they go through the ATP synthase, they turn the rotor, they bind ADP to ATP, and there we have our energy. Okay, so how much energy do these co-substrates or cofactors that donate the electrons, how much do they produce? Well, I got a little typo here, but hopefully you can deal with that. So for each molecule of NADH that is oxidized to NAD, 3 ATPs are produced. For every molecule of FADH2 oxidized to FAD, there's the typo, via the electron transport chain, 2 ATPs are produced. Now I have the 2.5 and 1.5 in parentheses. Those are kind of the more exact when we consider the investment of energy that we needed to get the electron to the electron transport chain through the TCA cycle, but probably in your book they'll usually refer to it as 3 and 2 ATPs, respectively. Okay, so I want you to take a moment and make sure that you can answer these questions and ideally write down the answers to these questions to ensure that you understand how this process works. So how does the electron transport chain participate in ATP production? How does it work, including the role of each component of the electron transport chain? And explain chemiosmotic theory. Okay, so our last topic is energy balance. How do we balance the amount of energy coming in with the ATP we produce? Well, our total energy expenditure, no surprises here, is our resting metabolic rate and our physical activity. Now, our energy expenditure is equal to our oxygen consumption because we can only produce as much energy as the oxygen that we're consuming. Now, RMR accounts for 60 to 70% of our energy expenditure in O2 consumption. And 90 to 95% of our O2 consumption is used by the electron transport chain to accept the electrons so that we can make ATP. The rest of the 5 to 10% is not related to ATP synthesis. Now, ATP homeostasis is tightly regulated so that the cell knows how much ATP to produce. And so it maintains a pretty consistent level despite fluctuations in use. So when we're exercising, we're using a ton. When we're sitting at our computer, as we are now, we aren't using as much. Or when we're sleeping, we're not using as much. And it's regulated to correspond with the rate of the electron transport chain. So this is the coupling that it talks about in the textbook. And this is regulated through ATP to ADP ratio and ATP utilization. So those are very intertwined. So the more ATP is used, the more ADP and inorganic phosphate concentrations increase. The more ADP, and then we have the more ADP available to bind to the ATP synthase. And when we do that, the more protons flow through the ATP synthase, and the more energy production we have. So through that process, the cell senses that we have more ADP, we're able to bind to more ATP synthase, move more protons through the ATP synthase, and we have more energy production. So we have this kind of checks and balances. So there's two major messengers that provide feedback for the rate of ATP utilization so that our cell knows how much ATP we've used and how much we need to make. So this is logically the phosphorylation state of ATP or ADP levels and the reduction state of NAD. So this is also a feedback mechanism, how much reduced versus oxidized NAD is in our cell. And our cell uses these levels to understand how much ATP we need to synthesize. So the TCA cycle and other oxidative pathways react very quickly to these changing concentrations to allow for consistent levels or homeostasis. So here's a really nice graphic showing the different spots where a feedback mechanism in the TCA cycle. Okay, so up here we have ATP and NADH levels, just like we talked about, and we have some others that we will focus on later. And these are negative inhibitors. So we have ATP. Our cell says we don't really need to make ATP. We have a lot of reduced NAD. Again, we don't really need to keep this process going. And then conversely, when we have either ADP or AMP building up, our cell knows, okay, we gotta make more of this. And this occurs throughout this TCA cycle. So NAD and ADP and their conversions of those are the major feedback mechanisms that allow our cells to know how much ATP we need to make. Okay, now it's not as simple as it appears. So we have this nice cycle that goes, not that it looks simple, but we have this nice cycle that goes around and around in our little animations. But in truth, it is a little bit more complicated because there are intermediates in our TCA cycle can also be taken out of that TCA cycle and used for other things. So here's a few examples. So citrate can be used for fatty acid synthesis. Malate can be used for gluconeogenesis. So when we take these substrates out of the TCA cycle, we need a way of refilling them so that they regenerate and we can keep our energy production going. And that brings us to the anaplerotic reactions. So just like I said, when removal of intermediates when intermediates are taken from the TCA cycle, it removes these carbons that we need for all of these reactions, for all of these oxidation reduction reactions, and it can actually stop the TCA cycle. So we need to replenish the carbon intermediates in this cycle. So one example of this is pyruvate carboxylase. And this enzyme is very high in the liver and kidney where oxaloacetate and malate are often taken out to use for gluconeogenesis. So that makes sense. So then we have this pyruvate carboxylase that's able to replenish this oxaloacetate from pyruvate. So we kind of, again, have these checks and balances. We're taking more of these intermediates out for gluconeogenesis, and we're able to put more in because we have these enzymes present. And also, amino acids can be degraded into TCA cycle intermediates. Okay, so I think this is our last slide. And again, make sure that you can explain these two, and writing them down would be even better. So explain the feedback mechanisms for ATP production and explain how intermediates of the TCA cycle are depleted and replaced. Okay, everyone have a great day. Bye.